Most people think of capturing and bringing black Africans as slaves during the transatlantic slave trade. It was the worst action that could be taken, but the truth is that people often miss the details that have been wittingly removed from history books. Only men were not enslaved, rather, black African women were captured too. They were cramped on the lower decks of slave ships that would take weeks or months to reach the United States. During this long period of the journey, the slave ship captain and crew would develop animalistic urges and desires to exploit the women on the deck. How they used to abuse those black African slaves for lust has literally shaken humanity. The ship crew and captains would think of new ways to satisfy their sexual desires. What was done to the African black women slaves, and how were they exploited sexually? During the transatlantic slave trade, an agonizing chapter in human history unfolded from the 15th to the 19th centuries. In this horrifying era, an estimated 12 to 15 million Africans were wrested from their homelands and thrust into the Western Hemisphere. Their deaths were cruelly intertwined with forced labor and abject suffering as these poor souls embarked on an atrocious journey across the Atlantic, lasting between 7 and 13 grueling weeks. Bearing witness to the depths of human debasement in the heart of this turmoil, the horrifying realities endured by the captives, especially black women, came to light. Regrettably, many remain unaware of the heinous atrocities committed by those who wielded power, slave masters and ship crew members alike. Black Africans, especially African women, who were now made slaves and already scarred by the trauma of displacement, were subjected to suffering. They used abuse as a weapon to methodically dismantle their humanity. The scars they bore were not just physical, they penetrated their very souls, leaving wounds that lingered far beyond the ship's horrid confines. The nightmare would start at the moment of their capture. Black women forced into a cruel theater of dehumanization were paraded at slave auctions. Their bodies were treated as commodities and exposed for potential buyers to inspect, reducing them to vessels meant solely for breeding. But the nightmare didn't stop there. Even before they boarded the nightmarish vessels, these individuals were subjected to invasive and degrading traders, subjected women and young girls to insufferable harassment, gauging their reproductive capacities through invasive and degrading measures. Their bodies became mere playthings for the traders, a reminder of their powerlessness. The abuse extended to men and boys as well, who were subjected to sexual assault and suffering. Cramming both men and women into spaces meant for cargo, not humans. These unfortunate souls were condemned to lives of subjugation in foreign lands. The ship's crew, fueled by insatiable greed and an utter disregard for humans' dignity, changed into traders of torture. They perpetuated a cycle of cruelty that was dehumanizing for enslaved African women denied even the most essential comforts. They were subjected to unspeakable atrocities that laid bare the monstrous nature of the ship. Many historians, like Angela Davis, have written about the sufferings of black African women slaves. She wrote that the ship crew was given free access to black women, slaves, so they could be raped and lustful women brought to their places, never objecting to whatever was said. Before we continue further, please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on these controversial matters. Let's continue now within the suffocating confines of the ships. Vulnerable women faced not only physical torture, but also the horrors of mental and emotional agony, malnutrition, disease, and dire living conditions, leading to alarmingly high mortality rates. The journey, already an ordeal of unfathomable proportions, was compounded by the wretched conditions they endured, yet the brutality did not stop at their physical suffering. The crews of the ship wielded their authority as abusers, employing violence and sexual exploitation as instruments of dominance. Dehumanization was their chosen method, stripping these women of their dignity, autonomy, and even their basic humanity. Their bodies, once temples of life and hope, became objects of malevolent desire, robbed of agency and voice. As if the horrors of the confined spaces were not enough, these women were stripped of their garments in autonomy. A twisted form of control dictated that they be robbed, becoming a haunting symbol of the helplessness that engulfed them. The deliberate separation from their male counterparts further deepened their vulnerability, rendering them easy prey for the predatory impulses of their tormentors. In some instances, The black women slaves were forced to stand naked before the inhumane gaze of the crew, a cruel theater of dominance that defied the bounds of human empathy. The white sailors and ship captains, armed with the privilege of authority, stooped to the lowest depths of humanity and exploited their positions to enact heinous acts of sexual violence against these defenseless women. Their abuse wasn't just about immediate physical dominance. It was a tool of power, a means to assert dominance and control and to reduce these women to mere instruments for their sick gratification. The spectrum of cruelty spanned from unwanted advances and degrading harassment to full-blown assaults, all executed in the chilling pursuit of dominance. The psychological trauma on these black women slaves bore a devastating legacy of etching wounds that seeped into the very essence of their being, stripped of their humanity. Their identities were reduced to objects of vile desire, yet satisfying passionate desires was not the only point, and crew members would go and find daughters and sisters of the resisting black male slaves. Then they would be ripped off of their clothes and made to stand naked before their brothers and fathers. The ship crew was allowed to use any means necessary to bring the slaves into subjugation. There have been reports of unethical and chilling incidents, like raping young girls between the ages of 8 and 10 on the slave ship decks. In some cases, the ship captain would choose the African woman, slave he wanted, and use her for over 3 nights, giving proof of the worst form of being human. The crew members would take turns silencing the same black woman by exploiting her lust. After this, they knew she would never rise and resist, and her relatives would stay in order. Sometimes African women slaves would give birth on the slave ships, and their children would add to the total number of slaves they held on the ship. However, when the mother of a newborn showed any disobedience, the slave crew would throw the newborn into the ocean. Yes, this was the level of humanity among Europeans who called themselves the most delicate human beings on those slave ships. The captain was the supreme ruler, and he could do whatever he pleased. He could play with the lives of the African people and sometimes satisfy his sadistic needs and desires. Since no ethics existed at that time, there was nothing the ship crew could not do. Even though sexual exploitation and the conditions under which it was done have been reported by various historians, the exact details were never reported. It's because the ship crew would never tell what they had done, and as for African people, their statements and sufferings were never heard and made part of history. But one thing is certain: black African women slaves would have seen how low humans can fall, experiencing lower than animal behaviors. But this doesn't end here. Just as female African slaves were abused by their slave masters, their male counterparts also had their fair share of such abuse from slave mistresses. Throughout history, documentation on slavery has predominantly revolved around the unfortunate tales of male slaves subjected to horrific abuse at the hands of their slave masters. However, a lesser-known aspect often overlooked is the existence of male slaves experiencing abuse perpetrated by their female slave mistresses. When examining the history of slavery, it is important to shed light on the often overlooked role that some women played as slave mistresses. While society may typically perceive women as nurturers, it is essential to acknowledge that some individuals, albeit a minority, participated in the inhumane treatment of slaves. During the 14th to early 19th centuries, it was a common practice in the US and Europe to stock slaves as economic goods. Slaves had a lot of economic significance, which made them a measure of how wealthy a given family was. Therefore, every wealthy family tends to make enslaved Africans a property of inheritance that is passed down from one generation to the next. There, we see how horrifying the lives of slaves were and how they were treated as objects. Tell us what your views are on these subjects. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.